We always assumed comets were simple creatures. Dirty snowballs, faint and fragile, dragged along predictable ellipses by the sun's gravity. That was the story I had been teaching for 20 years, the story I thought I understood right up until the night ALMA looked at 3i Atlas and saw something that shouldn't exist. A second tail, razor thin and perfectly straight, not fleeing from the sun, but pointing like a weapon into the dark. The first hint came as a nuisance, nothing more than a calibration headache buried in the logs. ALMA was in its long baseline configuration, dishes stretched across the Chilean plateau, watching 3i Atlas breathe out carbon monoxide jets at absurd distances where comets were supposed to sleep. We were mapping the coma, measuring line profiles, doing the boring work of real science. Then one of the junior analysts pinged me with a simple message. Why is the tail pointing the wrong way? I thought he meant the dust tail in the optical images. Solar radiation pressure and orbital geometry can make tails do counterintuitive things, curve and kink and even appear to lead the nucleus from certain angles. I almost answered with a pre-written lecture. Then I opened the dataset. On the brightness map, the gas coma looked perfectly ordinary, a broad, fuzzy glow roughly centered on the nucleus, a slight asymmetry where the strongest jet spilled sunward, but overlaid on that, so faint you would have missed it at a glance, was a needle, a line of enhanced emission, narrow as a hair, cutting straight through the map. It did not fan out. It did not curve. It did not care where the sun was. Is this an artifact? I asked the room eventually, breaking the low murmur of keyboards and fans. Side lobes, phase error, something stupid? We tore it apart the way astronomers do when reality looks wrong. We reprocessed with different weighting schemes, masked out antennas one by one, checked weather logs, local interference, the whole litany. The line stayed, changed the configuration, it stayed, changed the frequency band, it stayed. It was real in the only sense that matters in our field. It survived every attempt to delete it. The most unsettling detail wasn't its presence, but its direction. When we translated that pencil-thin feature from image space to sky coordinates, it pointed not away from the sun like a normal plasma tail, not along the comet's trajectory like a dusty wake, but toward empty space. More precisely, toward a position that, if you extrapolated 3i Atlas's orbit into a hypothetical perfect twin on the far side of the sun, would be exactly where that invisible copy should be. Of course, no one said mirror orbit out loud at first. The term was radioactive in our circles after a handful of speculative preprints had tried to explain every anomaly in the outer solar system with unseen shadow companions. But you didn't need to say the words to feel them. The vector drawn from 3i's nucleus through that radio-bright filament carved a straight line through space and ended in a sector that telescopes had never truly seen, always blocked by the sun's glare. A hidden arc of sky that, by cosmic coincidence or something worse, was exactly where a synchronized, opposite-phase trajectory would live. We did what scientists do when faced with something that smells like madness. We translated it into equations. One of the postdocs built a toy model, treating the narrow feature as a collimated outflow of millimeter wave radiation. Give it a beam divergence, a power, a nominal pointing jitter, then let it propagate across tens of millions of kilometers. The simulation spat out a cone volume, a three-dimensional tunnel in space that the beam would paint as the comet moved. Look, he said, spinning the model around on the big screen. It doesn't just point somewhere, it tracks somewhere. If you ride along the beam, its centerline traces a path, an orbit. The orbit it traced was not 3i Atlas's. It was its negative, same shape, same inclination, same eccentricity, but rotated 180 degrees around the sun. A ghost curve on the far side, perfectly matched, perfectly opposite. A mirror. No one laughed. We should have. Instead, we fell silent, each of us counting the ways this could still be a mistake. Maybe some subtle reconstruction bias was forcing the feature to align with a mathematically convenient path. Maybe we were cherry-picking, seeing patterns in noise because the human brain loathes emptiness. We added noise, shuffled baselines, randomized phases, the needle stayed, the orbit stayed. The beam, if that's what it was, really was writing a trajectory into space. The first official note we sent up the chain did not mention lasers or guides or mirror orbits. It spoke of a highly collimated anisotropy in millimeter wave emission, aligned with the inferred anti-solar conjugate of the comet's barycentric trajectory, bureaucratic camouflage. Anyone outside our little circle would read it, nod, file it away as another technical curiosity, but in the closed meetings that followed, behind VPNs and locked doors, we called it by what it looked like, a pointer. Suppose, one of the dynamicalists said, you wanted to bring an object into the inner solar system along a trajectory perfectly synchronized with 3i Atlas, but you couldn't see that object from here. Suppose it had no coma, no dust, nothing to scatter sunlight. How would you steer it? You could use gravitation, of course, let the sun, the planets, the galaxy itself do the work. But gravity is sloppy. It smears trajectories, amplifies small errors over time. To get a truly precise, phase-locked path, you'd need guidance, feedback, references. You'd need a beacon, I said, listening to my own voice as if it belonged to someone else. Something on this side, visible to us, invisible to it, drawing the line for it to follow. ALMA is seeing the pencil line, the dynamicalist finished, and we weren't supposed to. It's important here to remember that 3I Atlas was already strange before we found the second tail. An interstellar comet with a nucleus the size of a city, waking up at 16 astronomical units with carbon monoxide jets powerful enough to detect across half the solar system. It had been the darling of every observatory from Hubble to JWST, the star of 1,000 conference talks. We were already living through what we thought was the main story, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to dissect ice forged around some other star, long before our sun was born. The double tail changed the genre. It stopped being just a window into an alien past and started looking uncomfortably like a tool shaped for the present. We tried to prove ourselves wrong. Believe me when I say that. We wanted this to be benign. We stacked all the data from all the ALMA runs, from all baselines and all configurations, and looked for alternative explanations. Could the narrow feature be a jet of cold dust aligned by a magnetic field? The polarization said no. Could it be a calibration artifact anchored to a bright background source? The field was empty, and the line rotated with the comet, not the sky. Could it be a coincidental enhancement along some spiral structure in the coma? The line was too straight, its angular width too small, its stability too cruel. Eventually we exhausted our list of respectable ideas and did something more dangerous. We allowed ourselves, in an internal memo never meant to see daylight, to write down the unrespectable one. Scenario M, we called it, because naming an idea after a letter of the alphabet feels safer than calling it what it is. Scenario M assumed that the radio tail was a controlled emission, produced not by passive sublimation of volatiles, but by a process tuned to keep the beam narrow, bright, and aligned over time. It assumed that the beam was not an accidental byproduct of outgassing, but a deliberately exploited feature. And it assumed, most heretically of all, that somewhere in the invisible conjugate orbit, there existed an object with the means to see that beam, even when we could not see it. You don't need aliens for that last part. A perfectly matte, non-outgassing chunk of rock and ice would be invisible to our instruments for a depressingly long time, especially if cleverly shaped. But the moment you imagine such a stealth object needing guidance, you've already stepped out of the comfortable sandbox of natural dynamics. Comets do not steer. Their paths are written by gravity and chance. Scenario M said, this one is being written by something else. We argued about it in late-night video calls across time zones, faces washed out in the bluish glow of shared screens. Some of my colleagues refused to entertain it on principle. They were right to be cautious. History is littered with careers destroyed by premature leaps into the exotic. Others went the opposite way, building elaborate histories around the beam in a matter of hours, as if they had been waiting all their lives for an excuse to say the word artificial in a professional context. I tried to live in the narrow space between. I reminded myself that nature has had 13 billion years to become stranger than our theories. That just because something looks designed doesn't mean a mind sat down and sketched it, but I also watched other screens, far from the comfort of the array, and saw odd little events begin to cluster along the projected path of the invisible orbit. Events that made it harder and harder to cling to the idea that nothing was following that pencil line through the dark. The first of those events was small and technical, the sort of thing that gets buried in a systems engineer's report and never mentioned in a press release. One of the deep space tracking stations, listening to a probe in the outer solar system, recorded a brief but sharp phase jump in the probe's carrier signal. For 3 seconds, its apparent position shifted by tens of kilometers, then snapped back. No corresponding glitch appeared in the probe's onboard logs. From its own perspective, nothing had happened. When the station's data were plotted against our growing catalog of beam times, periods when ALMA saw the radio tail at its brightest and narrowest, the jump landed dead in the center of one. The probe, by sheer bad luck, had crossed the pencil line. For 3 seconds, the geometry that defined its position in our models had flirted with another definition, one anchored not to the sun and the planets, but to something else. When the beam passed, the universe changed its mind, and the probe settled back into its old slot. We wrote that one off as coincidence. We had to. One glitch does not make a pattern, but more came. Radar echoes from the outer planets that arrived a whisper too early when 3I's beam swept past their line of sight. Slight, repeatable frequency shifts in quasar signals seen when the radio tail was superposed on their line of sight during Earth's rotation. all tiny, all deniable, all stubbornly correlated with that impossibly straight feature the comet was drawing onto the sky. Meanwhile, the public story marched on, serenely oblivious. Press releases celebrated the detection of exotic molecules in 3I Atlas's coma, the unusual ratio of carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide, the way its dust reflected starlight. Beautiful rendered images showed a teal comet with a single, romantic tail arcing away from the sun. In none of them did a second, invisible tail spear through space toward a mathematically perfect twin. I still remember the night we finally pointed ALMA not at the comet itself, but along the beam. It felt like standing in front of a gun barrel and choosing deliberately to stare down its length. The observing proposal we filed for that run was dry and technical, describing a search for extended millimeter wave structure along the inferred anisotropy axis of 3I Atlas. In private, we called it what it was, a look down the throat. As the Earth turned and the dishes followed, the comet slid out of the primary field of view, leaving only the thin radio-bright filament, a line inscribed on the sky. We tracked it, not at its origin, but millions of kilometers downstream, where our model said the hypothetical invisible object would be if it existed. The images that came back were almost perfectly empty. That almost is doing a lot of work. At the center of the beam, smeared slightly by whatever residual jitter remained, there was a notch. Not a brightening, not a new source, but a lack of emission, as if something narrow and dense were occluding a fraction of the beam. Imagine shining a laser through fog and watching a razor-thin shadow where an invisible needle blocks a sliver of light. The fog is the comet's radio tail. The shadow, if our reconstruction was to be believed, belonged to a target embedded within it. Could be density variations in the beam itself, someone suggested weakly. Self-absorption, negative gain. Then why is it co-moving? I asked. We had stitched together hours of data, enough time for parallax and the comet's own motion to smear out any stationary artifact. The notch stayed centered on a single, moving track. It accelerated, decelerated, curved gently according to a set of orbital parameters that matched our mirror model to within the error bars. It was nothing, by every reasonable measure. No dust, no gas, no reflected sunlight. Just a moving absence in a beam that should not exist. You might think that would be the moment I broke, the moment I admitted to myself that what we were seeing could not be natural. It wasn't. Human minds are astonishingly good at compartmentalization. I filed the notch away in the unsolved problems drawer of my brain and kept showing up to meetings, kept helping draft cautious memos that tiptoed around the abyss. It was easier to focus on numbers than on implications. What finally cracked that numb professionalism wasn't a plot or a map, but a sound. ALMA is not, by design, an audio instrument. It listens to the universe in millimeter waves, frequencies far beyond human hearing. But any spectrogram, properly transformed, can be made audible. One of the junior researchers, playing around on a quiet night, took a time series of the comet's radio tail and ran it through a sonification routine, mapping frequency to pitch and intensity to volume. He sent me the file without comment. Curiosity made me put on headphones and press play. At first it was just hiss and slow, windy rises and falls, the natural breath of a turbulent plasma flow translated into a range our ears could appreciate. Then, layered atop that, came another sound, a thin, unwavering tone, too pure to be anything but a narrow emission line. It wavered slightly as the comet rotated, Doppler shifting up and down, and stitched through that, regular as a heartbeat, was a faint tick. Tick, tick, tick. I checked the metadata. The ticks were separated by intervals that matched to within milliseconds the predicted crossing times of the invisible object through the beam's central axis, based on our mirror orbit model. Each time the notch passed through the spacecraft's line of sight, the beam spectrum shifted ever so slightly, as if some of its energy were being siphoned off or redirected. Each shift produced a barely audible chirp in the transformed audio. I listened to that pattern over and over again, alone in my office long after the corridors had emptied. The rational part of my mind counted explanations, interaction with a dense clump in the coma, instrumental cadence, aliasing, and dismissed them one by one. The irrational part heard something else, the steady metronome of a system taking readings, making adjustments, following a guide in the dark. We later learned, from other observatories, that on the night those ticks were recorded, a series of minor anomalies had rippled through Earth's high orbit. A communication satellite briefly reported conflicting orientation data from its star trackers. A classified object in geostationary orbit dropped a fraction of a degree out of its assigned slot and then returned as if nothing had happened. A deep space probe's backup gyroscopes registered a torque that their primary sensors did not. Individually, those incidents were noise. Together, when aligned with the ticks in that whispered audio, they looked like a synchronization event. By then, the word guidance had made its way into our internal notes. Not prominently, never in subject lines or executive summaries, but tucked into paragraphs as a tentative hypothesis. The persistent alignment of the secondary tail suggests a function analogous to a guidance beam. One draft read before we scrubbed it back to something more palatable. The universe does not care how we name its phenomena, but our superiors do, and there is a line you cross when you start attributing function instead of behavior. All the while, 3I Atlas continued its slow fall inward. Its visible coma fattened, its primary tail stretched, the usual fireworks of solar heating painting a picture the public could understand. Night after night, people went outside with binoculars, hoping to catch a glimpse of the interstellar visitor. For them, it was a fleeting streak of light, a line on a photo, a story to tell their children. For us, watching the invisible second tail ride a mirrored orbit through the solar system, it was a pen hovering over a blank page, about to press down. We told ourselves that perhaps the invisible object would do what many long-period comets do: swing past the sun, feel its pull and heat, and be thrown back into the dark, never to return in any lifetime that mattered to us. That maybe this was just an unimaginably precise, unimaginably strange natural choreography, a cosmic coincidence so baroque we could be forgiven for mistaking it for intention. But late at night, when the beam ticks echoed in my headphones and the ALMA maps glowed on the wall, another possibility sat quietly in the corner of my mind. Guidance is not an end in itself. You do not draw an orbit, maintain a beam, and shepherd a stealth object across 500 billion kilometers just to let it leave. You do that when you want it to arrive somewhere very specific at a time of your choosing, in a configuration only you properly understand. And for the first time in a career spent measuring distant, indifferent things, I had to face a question I had always mocked in others. What if the universe had just pointed something at us and lit the way? We didn't lose the beam. That would have been almost merciful. Instead, as 3I Atlas crept deeper into the inner system, the radio tail became cleaner, sharper, like a focus slowly tightening. The side noise we'd blamed on turbulence faded, leaving a line so geometrically perfect it offended every instinct I had about natural processes. Natural things wobble, wander, hesitate. This did not. It was as if the comet had finally locked on. Around the same time, other observatories began to notice something unnerving in a completely different domain. Ground-based magnetometers, the sort used to monitor space weather and auroral activity, started reporting tiny, synchronized deviations. Individually, they were trivial, the kind of sub-nanotesla fluctuations students toss out as instrumental drift. But when a quiet graduate student overlaid those deviations with our beam strength curve, the match was obscene. Each time ALMA recorded a peak in the radio tail's brightness, Earth's magnetic field twitched, just a little, just enough to prove it wasn't imagining it. We convened a cross-discipline call, the kind that usually ends in polite shrugs and promises to keep an eye on it. This one did not. Plasma physicists, magnetospheric experts, time standards engineers, people who normally inhabit separate universes, all stared at the same plot and realized their data were humming the same tune. A line from an icy interstellar object, millions of kilometers away, was somehow in sync with the invisible cage of field lines holding our own atmosphere in place. No one knew why. A few of us were starting to suspect we knew for whom. The first official denial came faster than I expected. A brief, carefully worded statement appeared on an internal portal. No evidence of causal correlation between ALMA's observations of 3I Atlas and terrestrial magnetic fluctuations, anomalies within expected space weather variance. It was the scientific equivalent of a hand placed gently but firmly over our mouths. The same day, one of our proposed joint papers was quietly returned for further internal review, which in practice meant, please rewrite this until it stops scaring people who sign budgets. That night, I did something I would have considered unprofessional a year earlier. I printed out 3 of our most haunting plots: beam intensity versus time, magnetic twitch versus time, invisible object notch crossings, and taped them to the wall of my apartment. No titles, no axis markings, just shapes. 3 jagged, almost identical rhythms climbing across the paper. I sat there in the half-dark, lit only by the city's sodium glow and the silent blinking of my modem, and tried to pretend I didn't see them lining up like heartbeats in different bodies linked to the same machine. If you've ever spent decades treating the universe as fundamentally indifferent, you'll understand how violent it feels to start seeing coordination. Gravity is simple. Thermal emission is simple. Even quantum randomness in its own perverse way is simple. What we were watching now was not simple. It looked like orchestration, like a system using multiple channels. Radio, gravity, magnetism, to tune itself in. And the worst part was not that it might be happening, but that we had no framework to decide whether it was benign, hostile, or something so far outside those categories that the words themselves were childish. We tried to break the pattern the only way we could, by not watching. For one scheduled ALMA window, we deliberately pointed the array away from 3i Atlas, officially citing a need to calibrate against a standard field. Unofficially, we wanted to see if the Earth-side anomalies would persist without our gaze. Superstition wrapped in methodology. The comet, of course, did not care where we looked, but when the magnetometer data came in for that interval, something subtle had changed. The periodic twitches were still there, but their timing had drifted, as if whatever was coordinating them had lost a tiny, crucial feedback signal. "It's using us as a mirror," someone whispered in the control room when we reconstructed the beam track after the fact. Without ALMA's phase-lock stare, the radio tail's alignment had wandered by a fraction of an arcsecond, just enough to smear the invisible orbit's precision. When we turned the array back on in the next session, the beam snapped back into place over a few hours, like a hand correcting its aim. We weren't just observing the guide, we were part of the guidance loop, a reflective element in a system we had not agreed to be part of. After that, the urge to look and the terror of looking became indistinguishable. Turning ALMA away felt like dropping our one dim flashlight in a cavern where something large was moving. Keeping it fixed on the comet felt like leaning closer to an opening mouth. Meanwhile, the invisible object, we still refused to give it a proper name, kept following its penciled-in path, coasting along the mirror orbit with inhuman patience. Its projected perihelion, the point where it would skim closest to the sun, on the far side, crept around the calendar like a slowly ticking bomb. Then came the Jupiter event. We did not see it directly. Our instruments were never pointed the right way at the right time, but we felt it, the way a spider feels the pluck of a strand far from its body. Several of the gas giant's moons, those with exquisitely tracked orbits, exhibited minute, sudden timing shifts in their mutual eclipses. Nothing dramatic, nothing you'd notice without obsessively comparing predicted and observed light curves. But when you modeled those shifts as the brief passage of a compact mass threading through the Jovian system along the mirror track, everything snapped neatly into place. Something had skimmed the giant's gravity well, shaving a fraction of its orbital energy, bending its path just so. By then, a small, unsanctioned working group had formed among those of us who had seen too much of the data to remain calm. We met in encrypted chat rooms, under pseudonyms that fooled no one, sharing plots and fits and half-formed nightmares. The beam was no longer just a curiosity. It was a tool we were starting to understand in the worst possible way. The invisible object surfed that tool, using the sun and planets as stepping stones, shaving and adding velocity with a surgeon's precision. Each interaction left fingerprints in the form of those tiny, almost ignorable anomalies in timing, field strength, or signal phase, a breadcrumb trail written for anyone patient and frightened enough to follow it. One evening, after a particularly grim session, I found myself alone in the ALMA control building, the rest of the staff having gone home or fled to more cheerful corners of the campus. On the main screen, the radio tail map drifted slowly as new visibilities came in, the second tail a ghostly thread pointing past the sun to the unseen half of our orbit. Beneath it, a simple simulated solar system diagram displayed two curves, 3i Atlas on our side and its invisible counterpart on the other. The two were closing in on a kind of mirrored conjunction, not with each other, but with Earth. If you drew lines from the sun through both comets and extended them, they intersected our orbital path at 2.6 months apart. At the first, Earth would be 90 degrees away, safely out of the geometry. At the second, we would be almost perfectly aligned, like a target moving into the crosshairs of a scope someone had been tightening for years. We had not shared that particular plot with anyone outside the group. It felt less like data and more like a threat. Sleep became a stranger after that. I started to notice little things others might have dismissed as stress. Clocks on different devices drifting out of sync just enough to be annoying. GPS position fixes jittering a few meters, even on clear days with strong satellite coverage. Planes holding longer than usual and stacking patterns over airports. Their routing computers quietly fighting tiny inconsistencies in their navigational inputs. None of it dramatic enough to make headlines. All of it eerily resonant with the idea of a guidance system nudging the entire electromagnetic infrastructure of a planet into a slightly different shape. The last piece that made denial impossible arrived not from ALMA, but from a terrestrial radio observatory half a world away. They had been running a continuous spectral survey of the sky for months, a sort of all-sky heartbeat monitor, when one of their automated routines flagged a pattern. A narrow set of frequencies, mostly unused by human communication systems, had begun to exhibit a regular, global oscillation. The phase of that oscillation matched, within error, the crossing times of the invisible object through the extended projection of 3i Atlas's beam, as mapped by ALMA. In other words, each time our hypothetical stealth companion moved through an imaginary line drawn from comet to Earth, a standing wave rippled through our planet's own radio environment. Some of those frequencies, as it happened, were harmonics of bands used by critical infrastructure, aviation radars, deep space communications, even the time signal broadcasts that synchronized clocks across continents. The ripples were small, but they were there, riding atop our own emissions like a ghost signal, impossible to filter, because it used us as its carrier. You could not jam it without jamming yourself. You could not switch it off without turning off the world. If the radio tail was a laser pointer in the dark, Earth had become the reflective bead at its end. It was around then that the official tone shifted from wan reassurance to silence. Public updates about 3i Atlas abruptly narrowed to banalities. Discussions of its composition, pretty images, historical comparisons. The weirdness vanished from press releases as if someone had edited the universe. Internally, our access logs grew bristling barbs of new authorization levels. Requests for raw data that once required a password now demanded signatures, then in-person clearances. We were told, in gently threatening language, that speculative interpretation of sensitive observational anomalies in public foray could jeopardize funding. I considered quitting, walking away, pretending that comets were again just snowballs and tails were just pretty streaks. But the problem with knowledge is that it doesn't let go. Once you've seen a beam carving a mirror orbit through the darkness and watched your planet's systems twitch in time with its invisible passenger, ignorance is no longer an option. You may close your eyes, but the line is still there, drawn across the sky, and something is still following it. As I write this, 3i Atlas is closer than it has ever been, its primary tail now visible even to amateur telescopes under dark skies. People are out there taking photos, sharing them online with captions about beauty and awe and our tiny place in the cosmos. They see the bright plume, the glowing coma, the romance of a frozen traveler from another star. They do not see, cannot see, the second tail, the thin, merciless ray in the millimeter band, pointing straight past the sun to where a notch moves with impossible discipline. They do not hear, in the background noise of their devices, the faint ticking of crossings and corrections. We, the handful cursed with both access and context, sit in control rooms and home offices, watching the approach in plots instead of photons. We monitor the magnetometers and timing standards and orbital ephemerids like doctors, watching vital signs in a patient they are forbidden to tell the truth to. We run models of what happens when the invisible objects mirror orbit and Earth's path finally cross the same line of guidance. Most of those models end with nothing obvious. A passage in the dark, a tweak to constants too small to notice in a single lifetime, a subtle repointing of our entire frame of reference that only future civilizations, if any, will decode. A few models end less quietly. I do not know which future is real. I only know this. Somewhere between a real comet and an invisible mirror, between ALMA's dishes and the humming circuits of the devices you are using right now, a connection has been made. A line has been drawn. We did not request it. We cannot erase it. We can only decide whether to keep looking as whatever follows that line finally reaches the place we call here.